All right, so this is going to be the hardest part of this project. I just want you to know everything to this point has been pretty easy, but we're going to add some shading, and this is the picture we're going to be using to add the shading because I like this one because there's a very direct source of light. So what do I mean by that? When you look at this mug, you can tell there's a spotlight or a lamp or something hitting this object right about here, because there's such stark shadows over on this side of the mug. Now, when you really look at this, you see that you have some other small shading in here, in the inside of the coffee handle, underneath here, like where the lip of the mug is here. This is pretty bright, but look back in here. You have quite a bit of shading. And that's what we're going to be adding in today onto your newspaper collage. What can make this another layer of difficulty to this is that we're painting on top of newspaper. And newspaper is designed to be absorbent because it's designed to be recycled. And so it's designed to pick up and hold water, which means you're going to have to do this painting part in several steps so that you don't start to dissolve your newspaper. So when you put the first one on, you know, you're using your black. You want to go kind of light, so add in quite a bit of water so that it's not, I'll just show you a test here. You want it kind of gray instead of black, and so you can just put some more water in it. Because when you do this first layer, it's going to make your newspaper and the whole thing look much darker, because it's going to make your newspaper look dark. And then once it dries, it'll dry lighter. So I'm going to start on the coffee cup right up in here and add in my first layer of shading. Okay, so I started here with my black watercolor. You can see that it's gotten darker, but this is going to dry lighter than what you see. So while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to get some more black watercolor, and I'm going to just keep working my way down. So along inside the saucer, I have sort of this black or gray, you know, it's a shadow, oval. And what I'm doing here, you saw me do that black line, and then I went back and got water. And I'm trying to spread that around. Watercolor is tricky. You kind of have to make it, you have to work kind of quickly because it is designed as watercolor to dry kind of fast. And newspaper will dry even quicker. Now, because we're working on a collage surface that's not totally smooth, you may have some areas of shading that aren't perfect, and you may have some areas where it's kind of happening here. Your watercolor doesn't stick really good because your glue is making it resist, which means it is, it just won't stick to glue stick. That's okay. That's kind of the point of this, is where it's a little abstracted. Okay, so that's going to be my first layer here. Now, eventually I have to add in all this shading out here, but I got to wait for this to dry. Watercolor is an exercise in patience, right, Matthew? Yeah. I have a student in the room that is working on watercolor in another class right now and understands very much that it is. So now I'm going to work on the handle. And there's not a lot of shading on the handle, but what is on the handle is important. You know, those little areas, because we want it to make, want to make it stand out from the mug. So please keep in mind, just like whenever I've talked to you about how to draw things in this class, what you can't see is I am constantly looking at the picture that we're painting from. And your handle will be a little bit different shape than what's in the picture, and I'm not really worried about that. A lot of the shading in here is towards this inside. And we're going to do our first layer today. Sorry, my hand's in your way. but we'll be doing more layers on top of this. So again, this process is all about layering and patience and letting it dry. Because again, with normal watercolor painting, you can run a risk of, you know, moving your paint around too much before it's dry. But with this, because we're painting on newspaper, it's a really fun thing to paint on top of, but we have to be mindful that its job is to come apart in the recycling process. And we don't want that to happen on our paper. So you can even see here, you think about just a couple seconds ago when I started this shading, how dark it was and how much lighter it's dried. And even this is starting to dry lighter. So the lesson there is, like, once you put that first coat on, don't freak out if you're like, this looks so much darker than hers did. It'll dry, and it'll dry much later. And we just have to wait and be patient. So now I'm going to do the inside of the cup right here. And mine is not as wide as that, but still same idea. There's going to be shading in here. And I'm adding in more water so I can smooth this around. And you don't want hard lines either. Sometimes you can blend that out at this point. And then, like this one down here on the saucer that's kind of a hard line. When we start adding in the other shading, it's going to soften that effect. So again, it's being patient with that part. And slowly but surely, you'll start to see some three-dimensionality beginning to happen here. It's not going to be as obvious as the photograph because, again, first of all, this is a photograph. Even if we were just doing a drawing and a painting, and you're just working on flat, clean paper, it's going to have a different look than a collage. So now I'm going to go back here and do another layer, because look how dark. Very dark shading. So I'm going to do that here and let it dry. This is so hard. It's even hard in the classroom to tell or get students to understand, like, don't do too much too quick. Because they just want to rush and get it done in like one class. And I'm like, you just can't. Sometimes a part of it is just letting it dry. And I don't want any of that stuff. So I'm just getting mostly water now and smoothing out the black paint that was there. So it's blending, okay? It's a lot of blending. And you only have, like I said, a limited amount of time with watercolor because it does want to dry on you. It doesn't stay wet like acrylic or oil paint. So it gets a little more three-dimensional with every layer that you add. My handle needs more. This is not finished, but I really need that to dry good before I do the next part of it. So I'm going to look now at this very small little shadow here. Now, you will have already heard me say this. Don't paint coffee beans. Don't do any of that. None of that nonsense, okay? I don't care about that. So this is just, that's too dark, going to be like a oval. Very slight. And then I'm going to soften that quite a bit with some water here. And look, there's going to be parts on this where you might have been like, oh, I put too much paint. Oh, it dried. Now I kind of have a hard line there. It's okay. This is a very fun project because it's not going to be perfect. And everybody's will look a little bit different. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Now that looks kind of weird right now, but once we get all the other shading in, you know, it'll look okay. It's just going to take time and patience, okay? About every watercolor I've started, now I'm going to go back on my handle and do a little more. Every watercolor painting I do, there gets to a point where I've done multiple layers and I have to wait for it to dry, and it's sort of at this stage where I'm going, I've ruined it. It's official. I ruined it. And I feel like I ruined it. And once I let it dry and go back and do a couple more small steps, I'm like, oh my gosh, it looks really good. So that is just the nature of making art and the nature of trying new things. So be kind to yourself in this process, because I'm going to tell you right now, it happens to me all the time. And the shading on the handle is so specific. Like, it's very small. It's just like, oh, a small line here, a small line there. It's not as broad as over here, which, you know, try to paint what you see and understand that we've been working from several images. So yours is going to look different than mine. It would in the classroom. Okay, yours would look different from your neighbor. You know, this looks really dark, but I think I'm going to wait and let that dry and see how I feel about it, because it's a pretty dark shadow in there. I think I'm going to be patient and let that dry. Because see, when you look at it from a distance, now that handle looks like, oh, it does look 3D. Up close, you're like, oh my gosh, I feel like it's a hot mess. So it's always good, and I would make you do this in the room too. Step back and look at your work. You're working on top of a watercolor surface that has newspaper collage on top of it, and now we're putting watercolor on top of that. That's not easy, folks. So I would make you in the classroom, you know, go walk down the hall and get a drink of water if it was not, you know, pandemic season. Take a break for a second and come back and look at it, and you will be like, oh, now I see it. Or step away from it. You know, let it dry a little bit. We'll put it up on the wall, go back across the room and look at it. And you will be very surprised, like, oh, it does look good. And part of the hardest thing is painting what you see and trusting that in the end, I am painting what I see and it will be right. Because right now, me painting this really hard line here looks messy. But it's important because look how dark the shadow is cast where the mug sets down in the saucer. And now we start to get that feeling too. But up close, you may be thinking, this looks a hot mess. So I'm going to let that dry. And this still needs to dry more. So I'm going to give this a few minutes. And this is always a good time, you know. I know a lot of your classes, you kind of have to be glued to your screen the whole time. But sometimes when you're working on this at home, it's like a studio setting for an art class. You just have to let things sit a minute, you know. If you're making something out of clay, sometimes you just have to say, you know what, I have to be done on this for today because my clay is there's too much water in it. I can't carve into it the way I want or whatever. And that's okay. That's why it's called a studio. And in college, that's why the studio is open all night, because you might have to go home and sleep for 3 hours and come back and get your exam project finished. So it's just the nature of making art. But where your coffee cup sets down in the saucer is a pretty dark little area. See? So I'm going to let everything I've done to this point dry. I do want to try to get this shadow done, but I have to wait for this part to dry. So I'm going to pause the video, and then I'm going to put that shadow in, and that will probably be what I would consider our first layer of shading for today. Okay, so those of you that were like, oh my God, she's ruined her picture, see how much this dries down? So this area that was so dark right here is slowly getting absorbed into the newspaper and this paper. And it's looking good. It's starting to look a little bit 3D, and that's the goal. So what I'm going to do today for the last thing in this video is this part right here, this big shadow here. So this shadow is being cast from the cup down onto here. Now to do that, we're actually going to be painting over this area again. And a lot of times in watercolor, when you really get into the world of watercolor, and just so you know while I'm talking, I'm getting my paint. It is so much layering over and over top of stuff you've already painted. So it's not like you paint this section and you leave it alone forever. That's actually not, will rarely happen, okay? So I'm going to start about here, and remember, it's starting too dark, and it's going to look too dark for a long time. Hi, Jennifer. And now, get water in my brush, and you can tell here I constantly dab my brush. And before it starts drying too much, we're going to just spread that all the way around. I'm not going to get any more paint. I'm just going to spread around what I have. And as I go, I'm constantly rinsing my brush out so I don't get too much paint built up in my brush, because I really just want to smooth around the paint that's here. And look, I'm going to go ahead and paint over top of this, because this shadow in the end should be slightly darker than this one. So out here, I've done my first layer, but this is going to be like the second layer for this one, right? Now it's looking a little weird, but it always looks a little weird at first, because I've got to get some more shadows out in here that are more subtle. So remember, a little bit of paint and more water in your brush is how you get a lighter gray. There we go. I like that. Just adding a little gray out here. All right, and that's going to be my stopping point for today, except I'm going to take a picture of it when it dries so that you see how this should start looking. It's not going to look 100% at first. So if you start to feel nervous because you think yours is looking crazy, that's okay. And I just have a little bit of paint and water left in my brush, so I'm putting it back here, because as I was just standing here talking, I noticed this area of the saucer isn't as bright white as right here. So I just started adding a little shading there. Okay? Alright, so like I said, my picture posted will be of this when it's as dry as it possibly can be right now. And then you'll upload a picture of yours when yours is dry.